Hold out your hands and cup them together. That is your carrying capacity. About 2 liters, and only for as long as you never let go of anything. Now, put a baby in one arm. Now, walk 8 kilometers back to camp in the heat without spilling any of it. This is one of the oldest engineering problems our species has, and almost nothing we ever made to solve it has survived. Because the solution is a bag. And bags rot. Every episode of this series has quietly leaned on something nobody ever excavates. In the episode on stone tools, we ended on an uncomfortable idea. The Stone Age is not the name of a period. It is the name of what survived. This one is about the largest missing category of all. Not a weapon, not a hearth, a container. Something to put things in. Start with why that matters, because it sounds far too domestic to be important. A person who can only carry what fits in 2 hands is trapped inside a very small circle. You eat what you find where you find it. That is roughly what a chimpanzee does. The moment you can carry 20 kilos, every calculation changes. Now it is worth walking to the good patch because you can bring the good patch home. Now food can be collected by some people and eaten by others. Now you can cross country that has no water, as long as you bring the water. Now anything you own can be moved, which means you can still leave. Each of those sentences describes a different kind of society. And all of them sit downstream of a bag. In the episode on babies, we said the carrying sling may be the oldest tool we have and the one we can never prove. This is that problem, scaled up to everything else a person owns. So the real question is how you study a technology with almost no surviving examples. Archaeology has 4 ways in, and this episode is really about those 4. Freak preservation, impressions, residues, and inference from things that had to have been carried. Start with the freaks of preservation. Diepkloof rock shelter sits in the western cape of South Africa, in a valley above a river. Excavating there, a team led by Pierre-Jean Texier recovered something that does not usually come out of the ground. Ostrich eggshell, hundreds of fragments of it, and more than 270 pieces carrying deliberate engraving. They're around 60,000 years old. An ostrich egg is a natural pressure vessel. The shell is about 2 millimeters thick and startlingly hard to break. Grind a hole in the top, plug it with grass, and you have a water bottle holding roughly a liter that survives being dropped. And people did not simply use them. They marked them. The engraving is patterned, hatched bands running between parallel lines, repeated across many flasks. And the patterns change through the sequence. One motif dominates, then gives way to another over thousands of years. That is what a tradition looks like. Not idle scratching. Something learned, copied, and revised. Texier's team were careful with the word meaning. Nobody can read these marks. But you can say what they are not. They are not random, and they're not one person decorating one object once. And there's an obvious guess about what a mark on a water bottle might be for. Whose is it? In the episode on trade, we ended on the idea that beads may have worked like a passport, readable at a distance. A marked flask is the same idea, at arm's length, inside the camp. People in the Kalahari were still using ostrich eggshell flasks in the 20th century. They filled them, sealed them, and buried caches of them along routes, out in country with no standing water. Think about what that does. That is not a bottle. That is a road. A container turns land you cannot cross in a land you can. Now the actual bags and the frustrating part. The oldest baskets in the world are about 10,000 years old, and they are that age for a reason that has nothing to do with basketry. They come from the only 2 kinds of place that keep plant fiber: bone-dry caves and waterlogged ground. In 2021, in the Judean desert, a survey team lifted a woven basket out of the dust of the Marabiat caves. Complete, with its lid, large enough to hold about 90 liters. It was woven from plant fiber in a single piece by somebody who had very obviously done this many times before. And it was empty. Hold on to that detail. We come back to it at the end. The second case is a cave in southern Spain, near Albional, called the Cave of the Bats. 19th century miners pulled baskets, sandals, and cord out of it, made of esparto grass, and most of it was scattered or lost. In 2023, a team, led by Francisco Martinez Sevilla, redated what was left. The baskets came out around 9,500 years old, made by hunter-gatherers, not farmers. And they're not crude. They're finely worked in more than one technique, and some of the fiber was dyed. Which is the same lesson the flasks give. The oldest surviving example of a craft is never the first example of that craft. It is only the oldest one that happened to be lying somewhere dry. There is one more freak of preservation, and he is the best evidence in the whole episode. Otzi, the man who froze into an alpine glacier around 5,300 years ago, and who has now turned up 4 times in this series. Because the ice kept everything. We have something we have for no other prehistoric person. His luggage. A frame of hazel rods and larch boards, almost certainly the frame of a pack carried on his back. 2 cylindrical containers made of birch bark, stitched with bast fiber. One of them still held charred wood wrapped in maple leaves. He was carrying his fire inside a box in case he needed it later. A leather belt pouch holding his tools. A net of grass string. A woven grass cloak. Count them. That is at least 6 containers on one man, and not one of them is made of stone or pottery. Now imagine the same man dying anywhere warmer. What is left is the copper axe, the flint knife, and the arrowheads. That is not a hypothetical about bias. That is a measurement of it. So much for luck. The second route is better because it does not need the object to survive at all. It only needs the object to have touched something that does. In the episodes on clothing and on winter, we mentioned Dolni, Vestonice, and Pavlov in the Czech Republic 26,000 years ago. Olga Soffer and James Adavajo identified textile pressed in a fired clay, plain weave, twining, and netting. Fibre technology in the middle of an ice age, recorded as a negative. The thing itself is gone. The dent it made is still there. And this is where the container hides, because a single skill makes all of it. If you can twist plant fiber into cord, you can make a net. A net is a bag full of holes, but a bag. Soffer and Adavajo argued for what they called a string revolution, and their argument is really about accounting. We count stone tools because we have stone tools, so the Ice Age reads as a story about blades and points. Count the fiber, and it might read as a story about string. There is one more negative worth knowing, and it is a small delight. A great deal of early pottery carries the impression of the basket or the mat it was built on. The pot is a fossil of the basket. Which brings us to clay, and to the part of this episode where the textbook is simply wrong. Here is the order most of us were taught. People start farming. Farming makes villages. Villages make pottery. Pots belong with grain, with settlement, with the Neolithic. That order is wrong, and it is wrong by thousands of years. Xianrendong Cave, in Jiangxi Province, in southern China. In 2012, a team, including Wu Xiaohong, published careful dates for pottery fragments from the deepest levels. 20,000 years old. That is not merely before farming. That is the coldest stretch of the last ice age, when nobody anywhere was farming anything. Canyon Cave, in Hunan, gives around 18,000. In Japan, the Jaman pottery tradition begins by about 16,000 years ago, made by hunters and fishers. Along the Amur River in eastern Siberia, the same thing again. And in West Africa, at Aounjugu in Mali, pottery appears around 11,500 years ago as the Sahara turns green, independently. So pottery is invented several separate times, and every single time, the inventors are foragers. Then what were the first pots actually for? This is where residues take over, because fired clay soaks up the fats of whatever was cooked in it and holds them for thousands of years. In 2013, Oliver Craig and colleagues sampled 101 of the oldest Jaman vessels. The lipids came back aquatic: fish, marine, and freshwater animals. The oldest pots on Earth are fish pots. Not grain jars, not storage. Cooking pots, standing in a fire in an ice age, full of fish. Which leaves an awkward question. If clay is everywhere and fire is 500,000 years old, why is pottery so late? And it is not because nobody had worked out how to fire clay. At Dolni, Vestonice, the same site as the textile impressions, people were firing clay figurines 26,000 years ago. 6,000 years before the first pot, the technique already existed. It simply was not being used to make containers. So the missing thing was never the idea. The missing thing was a reason. Because a pot is heavy and a pot breaks. Carrying pottery is close to the worst possible thing to do with pottery. A pot is a machine for staying in one place, which means the arrow runs the other way from the textbook. Settling down did not follow pottery. Pottery followed settling down. And when the first potters turn out to be hunter-gatherers, that is what it is telling us. Some hunter-gatherers had already stopped moving. There's one more thing a container does, and it is why a fish pot matters so much. It lets you boil. You cannot boil anything without something to hold the water. Roasting is a technique of fire. Boiling is a technique of a container. And boiling is not just cooking. It is chemistry you can run at home. It renders fat out of smashed bone, which we met in the episodes on winter and on what people ate. It turns tough connective tissue into something you can drink. It leaches the bitterness and the poison out of plants that are otherwise ineatable, like acorns. It makes food soft enough for somebody with no teeth and for a child too young to chew. And you can boil long before you can make a pot. Drop fire-heated stones into a water-filled skin or into a pit lined with hide, and the water is boiling in seconds. That method leaves no vessel behind. What it leaves is heaps of shattered, fire-cracked stone, which is a category of find that sits in excavation reports under the heading of debris. A kitchen filed as rubble. That leaves the fourth route, and it is the one that works everywhere. Inference. You never find a bag. You find the contents sitting somewhere they could not possibly have walked to. At Sunghir in Russia, 2 children were buried under thousands of carved ivory beads. Somebody brought those beads to that grave. Nobody carries 10,000 beads in their hands. Seashells turn up hundreds of kilometers inland. Ochre turns up far from any ochre source. Camp floors hold the crushed remains of tens of thousands of small seeds, which had to arrive in bulk all at once. A hearth full of small seeds is indirectly a photograph of a bag. And that is the strange standing of the container in prehistory. It is implied by nearly every site and preserved at almost none. The most attested, unattested object we have. Which brings us to the twist, and this one is not about an excavation. It is about a story. In 1979, Elizabeth Fisher pointed out that the first cultural device was probably not a weapon, but a receptacle. A container. In 1986, the novelist Ursula Le Guin took that up in an essay about why we tell prehistory the way we do. Her point was about narrative. A spear makes a story. Tension, release, a hero, a kill. A bag makes no story at all. Something goes in. Later, it comes out. So the account of ourselves that we find satisfying is the one built around the object that happens to make a good plot. Now, set that beside the physical record. Stone survives. Fibre does not. The bias in the storytelling and the bias in the preservation point in exactly the same direction, and neither one knows the other exists. That is worth saying plainly. Le Guin was writing criticism, not archaeology. It is a lens, not a finding. But it does suggest something you can check, and the check keeps coming out our way. Every time preservation is unusually good, a dry cave, a bog, a glacier, they share the toolkit that turns out to be fiber, wood bark, and skin jumps. The record does not just underreport bags. It underreports them in a way we have never really corrected for. So the last word goes to the oldest complete basket in the world. 10,500 years old, woven in one piece, closed with its lid, and empty. Which is exactly right, because a container has no content of its own. Its whole job is to be about something else. That is why it never gets to be the hero of the story. And it is why the deep past is named after the hardest thing in it, rather than the most useful thing in it. The stone got a name because the stone stayed. Everything people actually carried their lives around and went into the ground and was never heard from again.